space has really provided so many amazing new inventions, new technologies, and people kind of forget that those new technologies come right back here to Earth. You know, there are so many things that we have today that we wouldn't have had if it wasn't for the space industry.
Aviators, welcome to the Flight Club podcast. I'm your host, Jason Middleton. I'm a pilot, I'm an aviation entrepreneur, and a huge fan of the people that make up our diverse aviation community. Today's guest on Flight Club has a long list of accomplishments at a very young age. She's a pilot. She's currently working on her PhD in astrobiology. She's attended every space camp NASA has to offer. She's a speaker. She's an inspirer. She's a modern day explorer, and she's quite likely going to be the first humans to set foot on Mars. Aviators, welcome Alyssa Carson, call sign NASABlueberry.
Thank you so much for having me.
Welcome to the podcast. So happy to have you here. So we have a lot to cover today. You have so much that is going on in your world. I'm going to try and keep us on track to some certain things, but I just wanted to open up with, the show with, how'd you get the call sign? Where'd that come from?
Yeah, so, when I was first getting interested in space, I kind of heard a little bit about the story of call signs and how it originated kind of more in the military, but then as most astronauts were coming from the military, it became very common for astronauts to also have call signs. So when I was first going to space camp, I was interested in the idea of call signs, and, I wanted one of the blue flight suits that all of the astronauts and all the trainees had. So we looked, and I was actually too small to fit in any of the flight suits that Space Camp had to offer. So my dad ended up finding basically this knockoff flight suit, and it was a really dark shade of blue. So I basically stood out from everyone else. And so everyone just started saying that I looked like a little blueberry when I was wearing it. And so the name Blueberry just kind of stuck. And then I even remember coming back to Space Camp like the next year, and they would say, "Oh, Blueberry's back." And so the name Blueberry just kind of kept coming up over and over again, and it kind of just stuck. And so kind of just been known as Blueberry ever since those first space camps.
It's a great call sign. And the funny thing, I have a lot of friends that are fighter pilots, military pilots, and they all have call signs, and none of them pick their call sign.
Right.
It's always picked by somebody else. So it's a good one. Okay, well, so I wanted to jump right into Mars. Like, we're going to cover a lot of stuff, but Mars fascinates a lot of us, and especially recently, it seems to be opening up as a possibility to actually explore Mars. And why is it important to go to Mars?
Yeah, I think that exploring Mars is really important. I think that we've always been interested in Mars. In fact, kind of next to Earth, Mars is really our next most studied planet, right? The planet that we've sent the most rovers and satellites and kind of gained the most information of, just because we've been so fascinated for so long. And I think kind of with the natural progression and stepping stones in the space industry, Mars is kind of like our next destination. We could go the other way to Venus, but Venus is kind of hot and horrible, so we're kind of going to go the other way to Mars, which is a little bit more inviting to sending people to. But I think that Mars really is kind of that next step for us to visit and kind of push exploration. So I think that's been a really big area of interest. And then also the potential of life, especially in kind of my area of interest within astrobiology. But the potential for life on Mars has kind of been a huge question that we've had for so long. And whether Mars used to have life or still has life is kind of still up in the air. But, rovers and those satellites and all the research that we've gathered so far is really, really great. But nothing can really compete to the amount of information we're able to gain once we send people to Mars, right? So whenever we have rovers on Mars, we kind of have that time delay between Earth and Mars. Whereas if you have a person on Mars, they're like, "Ooh, that rock looks interesting. Let's go collect a sample. Let's go run a test on that." And so humans can do so much more research in the time that a robot could. So that's kind of some of the major goals that we have with going to Mars. And then also just kind of pushing ourselves to see if we're even capable of living on another planet. And
that was one of my questions. So these rovers that have gone there, they've studied a lot of things. Have they studied, the atmosphere? There's really, a few things you need for life, right? Water, air, shelter, food. You being an astrobiologist, I'm assuming that this is some of the things you're studying. What exists on Mars that's actually similar to Earth? Like, is it possible that we could actually create a sustainable life on Mars? Is it scientifically possible?
Yeah, I think the possibility of Mars becoming a potential kind of like similar to Earth is kind of the big question mark. I think that scientists are pretty firm in the belief that Mars used to be similar to Earth in some degree. So we're pretty confident that Mars used to have running water, used to have water on the surface. And that's why a lot of the current rovers on Mars are kind of in sort of where we think like deltas used to be, where we think water used to be. And that's kind of our targeted areas to look for signs of life. And so we think there's a lot of potential in Mars's past. And it's really now just kind of turning gears now as we learn more about Mars's past. How can we now switch that to say, okay, now what can we do with that to progress Mars's future, or what could the future of Mars be? And obviously the term terraforming has been thrown out there for several years, but
I watched Star Trek. It was
that possibility is definitely out there. But I think some of those things we don't firmly know until we actually have people there saying, okay, this is what we could do.
Yeah.
And regardless of everything, it's going to take some time.
Do you think studying what has if we get humans up there, or we have the rovers or whatever, we're studying Mars, is it dawning on the scientific community that Mars may be the future of what Earth is moving towards? Has anyone talked about that? Yeah,
there's all sorts of ideas of how Mars basically got to the point it is, right? So we think that at some point Mars used to be more similar to Earth, but then how did it end up to be kind of this more isolated, dry place that it is now. And so there's a lot of ideas of how that happened. And I think a lot of learning about Mars also is learning a lot about Earth's past and kind of where we're headed. But, I think that the point of wanting to go to Mars is really to progress where we are. I think that whenever we look to Mars, it's really saying, wouldn't it be a really nice idea to have another place that humans could live on, another planet that we could survive on? And Mars really isn't the final destination, right? Kind of the future of all of humanity would be to continue to be able to explore space and be able to kind of, survive in some of these more extreme environments. But Mars is really that first step to say, are we able to basically turn another place into a home to where, even just something as simple as population continuing to rise, even if Earth's conditions are as good as they are right now, are we able to sustain that many people? And so Mars would kind of be that first step of, okay, are we able to have another place to have even more people living on?
Yeah. I mean, it's so inspiring too, to just to think about all the possibilities too, and going that far away, and landing a spaceship on another planet that's that far away. I know we did it in the with Apollo in the 60s, but Mars is a very different story. It's a lot farther away. It's like over 150 million miles away, and it's a lot of time and space, which brings up some of my questions about how are we getting there? Like, what do you and I spoke a little bit about this before the show, but traveling to Mars is not insignificant.
Yeah, no, that is very true. I think that really the travel to Mars has been our biggest deterrent on actually getting to Mars. I think one of the biggest worries at the moment is radiation levels. Radiation is a really, really big issue when it comes to space travel and keeping the astronauts safe from the amount of radiation that they're exposed to. We're very lucky on Earth to have, our atmosphere, and a thick atmosphere at that, to be able to kind of protect us from a lot of that radiation that's out in space. But once you go to a planet like Mars that has a very thin atmosphere, you're exposed to a lot more. And so I think that's been one of the biggest issues, because if we're looking at current technology, it's going to be close to 6 months to get from Earth to Mars, and then living on Mars until kind of the planets line up again, and then another 6 to 9 months to come back. And so
because you have to live there's only every 2 years or so with the Earth and Mars in alignment to actually travel back and forth?
Right. It's a pretty small window, right? And it takes some time. You're basically going to have to go through a full orbit of the planets for that closest point to be aligned again, right? Because sometimes Mars can be really close to Earth, and sometimes it can be really far away. And so we'd rather launch when it's closer. And so that kind of adds a whole nother level to it. And so I think that, that's where a lot of gears have turned to wanting to advance our technology a little bit more in hopes of a mission to Mars. NASA has really been working on changing from our current technology, which is about 6 months, to getting some newer engines that would actually reduce that time from Earth to Mars down to 6 weeks rather than 6 months, which would be a huge advantage.
And how much is the private sector helping out with that? Companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin, are they contributing to this technology?
Yeah, I think that the private sector, it plays many factors, I think. One, just in the level of competition, right? And kind of edging the government industry to kind of move a little bit quicker. Space is a very slow business, and I think we kind of all see that with, how long it takes for a rocket to be built, to launch, and all the testing that goes into place. But, during the Apollo days, whenever NASA was working on sending people to the moon, you had that level of competition with Russia at the time, which really led to a lot of things happening a little bit faster. And I think the private sector is kind of fallen a little bit into that role. Obviously, a lot of private industry is focused on low Earth orbit, but companies like SpaceX are, having conversations about sending people to Mars. Blue Origin has even made some comments about working on, involvement with going back to the moon. And so as the private sector starts moving from just low Earth orbit now to deeper space, now you have a little bit more of a competition field and also just assistance, whether it is a competition or working together to build that technology. I think either way, it's a benefit.
Is there, for the outside of government contracts and building rockets for NASA and getting paid a lot of money, is there any other motivation for private companies to go to the moon and Mars? What is there for them?
Yeah, I think that whenever we think of going to space, we think whether it is, the competition or, just the kind of need to explore or maybe the science. But I think in reality, I think a lot of these private companies really see the benefits of going to space. And I say that just because so much of the time we see space as almost like a money pit. It takes millions and millions of dollars, right, to build a rocket, to test it, to send people to space, even just going to the International Space Station. It takes a lot of money and a lot of resources to get there, and I think a lot of people don't see the actual benefit or income or return on that investment that we're making. But, space has really provided so many amazing new inventions, new technologies, and people kind of forget that those new technologies come right back here to Earth. There are so many things that we have today that we wouldn't have had if it wasn't for the space industry. But, because space kind of pushes us to think outside of the box and outside of our day-to-day lives, we kind of come up with these new technologies and these new ideas, and that really does come back here to then be used for whatever issue it could solve here on Earth as well. And so I think that the private industry sees those benefits as well,
for sure,
and sees how that can be of help. And, SpaceX specifically has really had a good mission on focusing on reusability in space, which I think has really helped on the amount of funds that they're putting towards these rockets, because they're so focused on getting those rockets back and reusing them. And so they've really kind of changed the game, I think, in reusability with space.
I've been so impressed with SpaceX and how fast they've monetized space with launching the satellites and Starlink. And, we're installing Starlink on airplanes now. And it's, it was only introduced to the world a year and a half, 2 years ago. That's how fast the private industry moves. And I had a friend that worked for Lockheed Martin in their rocket program years ago when SpaceX was just starting to launch out at Vandenberg. And he pretty much said, these guys are going to put us out of business because we can't build anything as fast as they can build. We can't even come up with a plan, and they're launching rockets. And these older aviation, aerospace companies have been built on the backbone of government regulation. And whenever you add government regulation to something, it adds complexity and just slows the process down. So I think it'll be interesting to see how private industry works with NASA. And I think you have to have a NASA involved in something like going to space. There's no way somebody could pull it off in the private sector. But I think the support is really important. So it's good to hear that. It seems like you have a pretty good grip on how all that works as well. Kind of going back to Mars, Alyssa, so astrobiology, really quick for our listeners, what is astrobiology?
Yeah, so I like to describe astrobiology as kind of like an interdisciplinary field within how all the sciences apply to space. So it really kind of brings in, how biology merges with the chemistry that happens in space. And it really just is kind of looking at a lot of research that's going on in space. A huge field is planetary protection and looking at how we look for signs of life while also, kind of protecting life here on Earth. When I say astrobiology, most people jump to aliens, which I love to hear. That works as well. And although we're not necessarily looking for like green men walking around on Mars, that type of alien life could also be encompassed in like microbiology and bacterial life. And so that's kind of my more area focus within astrobiology. Some people lean more like origin of life. Some people lean more like plants and how we go to like growing biologicals in space environments. So astrobiology really can span a whole lot of different areas. But for me specifically, I've really gone back to potential life specifically on Mars. And, and when we say life on Mars, we really do emphasize those biological signs of life and more bacterial, right? We don't think that there's anything complex on Mars, but anything more bacterial would be possible.
What would you consider complex? Is it if you found life on Mars, above the bacterial level, what is complex?
Yeah, I think complex, we just are meaning kind of the next step of life, whether that's more complex proteins, more complex molecules, whatever it may be, more so the type of life that we see here on Earth. Obviously, Earth has so many types of bacterial life, archaeal life. There's a whole lot of life that we have here on Earth that we don't even really consider, right? We really focus on more like animals and people and things that are much larger. Whereas once we go down to that kind of like microbiological scale, now we're getting more towards that more simple life where it's only like one protein or like one element that's really in effect.
Yeah, that's cool. Do you think, do you believe that there is a potential for intelligent life beyond, our galaxy here? I mean, it's statistically speaking, it seems more probable than not. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think I completely agree. I mean, just as you said, I think that just statistically that there has to be something somewhere, right? And I think that although we don't necessarily think that there's intelligent life in our own solar system or maybe even potentially in our own galaxy, I think that space is just so large and there's so much possibility that there has to be something somewhere. And I think that when looking far back into space and, with all the amazing telescopes and technology that we have, whenever we look back into space, it really is looking into the past because it really takes a lot of time for these light years and the light to actually travel all those light years to us. And so when you look back into space, it's looking into history. And so there could be a civilization now that wasn't there previously, or even if it's the same way, if potentially there's aliens out there looking at us, or even if they looked at Earth, it could be a possibility that they don't even see that we're here yet. And that's just really grasping how large space is. And I think that's really hard for a lot of people to kind of comprehend how big space really is and how much room there is between us and maybe a potential other intelligent life.
Yeah, it is mind-boggling. I mean, when you lay there in bed and you think about space and how far things are and how tiny we are, it's almost like overwhelming. To normal people, I would consider myself a normal person as it relates to space travel. I'm a pilot, but like it's flying to, flying to the other side of the planet is a really, really long flight. And you feel like you're on the other side of the planet so far away when you start thinking about the moon and Mars and then beyond, and you haven't even like scratched the surface. When you think about how big it is, it's just mind-boggling. So I think that, do you think we'll ever know? I mean, in our lifetime and in your lifetime?
Yeah, it's a really hard question to answer. SETI is an organization, the Search for Extraterrestrial Life. They're kind of always out there listening for any sort of signature for there to be signs of life. And I think that we're kind of always open to the idea and open to the hunt of life out there. But, getting a firm answer on it is always tricky. And
Yeah.
to be fair, it's kind of a hard answer with anything in science. We're always asking questions. We're always debating. We're always saying, but what if this? But what if that?
Yeah.
And so I think that's just kind of part of the scientific process is, there could be potential, there could be signs of life in so many different facets. But I think that the point of science is that we're always questioning whether there could be or can't, and we're really continuing to do more and more research to get to a point to where we're proving it.
Yeah.
So I think the point of proving whether or not there's life out there will be pretty far in the distant future, but I think it's always good that we're kind of questioning whether it could be or can't.
Yeah. Not to compare, I'm going to take us on a little side journey here. Not to compare going to Mars to camping, but I know when I go on a camping trip and I'm loading vehicles up and my truck up, it's a lot of equipment and it's a lot of things you got to think about. Like, we're going back into the backcountry. I've got to take this. When you go to Mars and you're going to be there for a long time, like how does one approach that? How does NASA and people like potential astronauts, right? When you're thinking about all the things that you want to do on this planet, that you're going to be there for months and months and months at a time, and you're preparing to do scientific experiments and the things that, because you don't even know what you don't know yet. Like, how do you prepare for something like that? Like,
Yeah.
what are you going to take?
Yeah, I think that with the potential for a mission to Mars, that's kind of a really big thing to keep in mind is everything that we would want to accomplish while we're there. And I think that's a really big goal of multiple missions to Mars, as well as kind of learning along the way. But I think kind of the big idea with a mission to Mars has always been, if we have a mission that has humans on it, we want to prioritize the humans, right? Mm-hmm. So we want to make sure that they're safe, that they have food, that they have supplies, and that they're protected in any way, right? So humans are always the priority, whereas whether it's experiments or scientific equipment, that kind of all comes secondhand. And so a lot of the ideas of whether it was sending habitats or sending equipment, a lot of that, as much as we could send beforehand, would kind of be the general idea. If we could send a lot of the equipment that we would need to Mars beforehand to land there, and then that way whenever humans go, because weight is kind of a really big importance whenever we're going to space. It takes a lot of fuel and a lot of thrust just to get us off of Earth, and so we want to prioritize that the stuff that's actually with the astronauts is going to be benefiting the astronauts. And so there's been a lot of ideas of how to get that stuff to Mars before the astronauts actually arrive, to almost set up things a little bit before astronauts get there. There's also been kind of ideas of the astronauts will essentially launch off of Earth and then connect to almost like a miniature International Space Station with a lot of supplies on it. And then that will be what will travel to Mars. So that way, that kind of already has a lot of equipment on it up in space. And so a lot of these things are really still being figured out because we're trying to approach it the best way that will keep the astronauts the most safe.
Yeah. And I mean, the things that I've done a little bit of research on this, not obviously as much as you, but I've looked at a lot of the kind of options in going, and what they did with the Apollo missions is completely different than what they would do here. And I've one of the things I've learned a lot about, we're just going to launch stuff and land it up there, and we're going to launch all of our camping gear onto Mars, and then we'll fly in later. So back to traveling to Mars, and until the tech changes, you're going to be gone for 3 years if you go to Mars. I mean, does that scare you?
Yeah, I think that the timeline of going to Mars has kind of been thrown out there. I mean, right now with current technology, it's looking more, as you said, closer to 3 years. And I think that's kind of been the biggest concern, right? I think that the biggest concern with Mars is the length of the mission to Mars. And so I think that's kind of been the biggest discussion is, do we even send people until we get that timeline shortened? Yeah. Whether that's with better technology, better engines, different ideas of sending people. But I think that really is the biggest concern, right? Not only for supplies or radiation levels, but even just humans being exposed to space for that length of time, or even outside of Earth's gravity for that length of time. The human body has a real effect when it's in space, and there's been a lot of research into how your bones and your muscles and your eyes and how all of you really changes when you're exposed to microgravity. Our bodies really do adapt to the environments that we're in. Sure. And so that's been another big concern is, can we even have people in microgravity or in that space environment for that long? And so I think that's why with Mars, that timeline has really been what has scared us the most.
Yeah.
And I think that's really where most of the research and ideas are coming from now, is how do we even shorten it or protect the body in a way to kind of have that. So I think maybe we aren't looking at a mission until we kind of have some of those bigger questions figured out.
Yeah.
No matter which way the area of science kind of leans towards, whether it's shortening the mission or more research on the actual body and how we protect it from space. But either way, I think we have to have some sort of solution prior to just sending people to be in the space environment for 3 years.
Well, I mean, just, in aviation, we all know things break in airplanes. We'll do you experienced that probably today, flying in. There was something wrong with an airplane, and it delayed, and it's just pieces of equipment that's built by humans. And for a piece of equipment to last that long, over that many miles, and with the life support systems and navigation equipment and communications equipment, and the engine systems and all the things that a piece of equipment needs, a spaceship needs, it's a lot to ask for that long. So. And you have to get it right. If you're sending humans that far, it's got to be right. Can't be, with an airplane, if something doesn't go right, we land. And, so to me, I was thinking about this, and it was one of the questions I wanted to ask you. I'm like, God, being gone. I mean, my son, I have a 12-year-old son. He went to, he's at camp right now for a month, and I miss him already. When you fly into space and you're gone for months, you have family on the ground that loves you and misses you, and it's not just you; it's like a whole group of people around you. So, I recognize how heavy that must be sometimes when you're thinking about this stuff. So, let's say you years into the future, you just landed on Mars, and you got out and you're walking around, kicking rocks, and what would be a big surprise? There's a lot of known things about Mars because the rovers, but there's obviously a lot of unknowns. What would really excite you and surprise you if you're on the ground in Mars and you've discovered something?
Yeah, I think kind of to me, the biggest just impact of being on Mars would be just to be in that environment, having a place where it's really just rocks and dust and soil around you, and it's kind of a whole different environment than something that we could experience here on Earth. And so I think being fully surrounded by that environment, obviously the impact of, all of the people on Earth kind of supporting you and you being able to kind of take that step for them and kind of be the person there, I think is a huge impact. But yeah, I think really just kind of embracing all of it and embracing the surroundings and obviously the excitement of a lot of the research that there is to gain from actually, being there and, being able to just kind of bend down and touch the soil and kind of collect that sample, I think is huge because, a lot of areas of interest with Mars now are kind of more deeper into the subsurface because, the surface of Mars is kind of exposed to a lot of stuff, but, once you start going underground, there's a lot more potential of things that could be potentially surviving.
How deep have we drilled into the surface so
Not far.
Inches, right?
Yeah, really not too far. It's only a few inches. A lot of the rovers that are on Mars, they kind of have claws. They'll dig, a little bit, but we've never actually, I would say, have a drill to go down.
What's down there?
Right, exactly, to kind of have more cores, which is kind of leaning more a little bit to what we want the future of some of these scientific equipments to have is to have go a little bit deeper because anything that's deeper is going to be more protected. And so that's kind of an area of interest. Yeah,
and it's just preserved. I mean, there could be potentially fossils down there. Mm-hmm. And I was, you mentioned the bacteria, right? The microorganisms in a planet. You have to be careful with the equipment you're sending there too, because they may bring bacteria in, right? So if you send a rover in, how do they protect that from making sure that there's no bacteria on it before it goes up? What do they do?
Yeah, so a lot of equipment that gets into space, whether it's going to a planet or honestly just out into space in general, a lot of that equipment is kept in clean rooms. And Basically, we try our best is the easiest way to put it. I mean, bacteria can be very tricky to deal with and can be very stubborn and can kind of survive in more environments than maybe we would even think.
Yeah.
And so whenever equipment is really sent to Mars or other places, basically NASA and all the amazing companies that have been working on these different pieces of equipment, they really do try their best to keep it as clean as possible. And a big kind of goal has also been trying to keep some of those areas of Mars completely untouched.
Yeah.
So over the years, there's kind of been different designations of more areas of specific interests and more areas that maybe we can be a little bit more lenient on of sending, potential contamination. And so we've tried to kind of keep a balance of where do we send stuff and where do we not. So that way, there's always some area that we hope is completely uncontaminated. But yeah, the question, even when we sent things to the moon, there's kind of always the question of whether or not what we were getting back, is that moon bacteria somehow, or is it, maybe just stuff, is it just us bringing the bacteria there? And that's kind of a big question when it comes to life, just because there's always a potential that we could just be contaminating it, or it could be life somewhere.
What's the current thought on preserving the ecology of these places like the moon and other planets? Do we, do we have a responsibility to maintain a pristine environment? Like how is that being addressed?
Yeah, so there is a little bit of a responsibility. So there's kind of this newer-ish field of planetary protection that is really focused on as we start sending more and more stuff to either the moon or Mars, and especially the idea of sending people there. There's a huge goal of planetary protection and making sure that we're really being aware of what we could be bringing. There's a whole lot more research going on even on the International Space Station of they're bringing swabs actually on their EVAs when they go outside of the spacecraft and actually swabbing the outside of their spacesuits. And they're finding, small samples of skin bacteria out there. And so we're realizing more and more, the more that we learn, that some of these bacterial creatures could be surviving in those environments. And so I think it really is just kind of being more aware. And depending...
Does that excite you as an astrobiologist? Like, this stuff is actually living in no atmosphere?
Yeah, I think it does. I think for me, since microbiology is kind of like my area of astrobiology, I think that it really does excite me to see how not only humans adapt to these environments, but all kinds of life really do adapt.
Yeah.
And I think it really just proves that it really adapts much more than we even think it would. Obviously, we tend to think of like extremophiles and the types of life that kind of thrive in these environments, but it's not even about thriving. It really is just surviving. And I think that if something is surviving in these environments, then that's something really important to note and something really just to keep in mind as we continue to move forward.
Wow. God, it's amazing how much you know. Like, you know a lot about all of this stuff. It's just fascinating to me. I mean, I guess you have to be like that if you're going to be a candidate that's going to be doing these things. You have to know a little bit about everything, and you know a lot about something. What was your first interest in space? Like how long? I've heard the stories about the cartoon. Tell me about that.
Yeah, for me, I've really just kind of been fascinated with space ever since I was a little girl. I kind of don't remember not being interested in space, and my dad kind of remembers a lot of me asking questions about space and just kind of where all things space even originated from or what we had done in space. But no one in my family really had a space or science or similar background. And so my dad told me a little bit about what he knew about the space industry, which wasn't much. And, our kind of idea of thinking that my interest in space stemmed from the Backyardigans or that cartoon on Nickelodeon.
The Backyardigans, that was it.
Really just kind of came from, we couldn't think of any other place that I even would have heard the word space. Because at that young of an age, we weren't learning about space in school. I wasn't really exposed to that from anyone in my family. And so I had a Mission to Mars episode of the Backyardigans. I had a poster for that episode in my bedroom. And so we kind of just looked at it and started thinking, okay, maybe that was the starting point of where I started to ask more and more questions about space.
I think it's such a fascinating thing with kids. Like I have 3 kids, all different ages, but I really want my kids to explore. If they're going to watch TV, just let them find things they're interested in. Like my son, my youngest, my 12-year-old, one of his favorite YouTubers is Mark Rober, he was a NASA engineer, and he is just fascinated now with engineering. He's 12 years old, and that's what he wants to do. And it's from him watching YouTube. So it's like, as a parent, do we want to restrict our kids from some of these things that might pique something like becoming an astronaut? It's an interesting thing. We want to kick the kids out of the house, get out of the house, go play, don't do this, don't do that. But inspiration can come from a lot of different places. How we were inspired as kids is different than how you were inspired as a kid, obviously. What about space camp? Tell me about your first. You've been to all the NASA space camps?
Yes. So space camp really was. I always say that space camp was kind of like my version of Disney World, right? Every kid kind of wants to go to Disney World and wants to ride all the rides. But for me, it really was wanting to go to space camp and wanting to see what it would be like to be an astronaut. And, I first found out about space camp. We were on a family road trip and saw a billboard for the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama. Mm-hmm. And, my family members kind of knew that I liked space, so they thought, let's stop just to let Alyssa see some rockets or a few things. And I came home with a brochure for space camp and was like, I want to go, and was basically dying to go to space camp. So when I was really young, me and my dad did basically like a family camp. So he came with me, and so the two of us rode the little rides together and learned about space and built model rockets. And
is that where you got the jumpsuit?
Yes,
the original NASA Blue. Okay.
Right, exactly. Yeah, tying back to that. That was kind of one of the first times that we were exposed to that and looking at the flight suits and that sort of thing. But it really was.
I have a question. Did your dad wear a flight suit?
He did.
He
yes,
did?
Yes. So we all got the flight suits.
We got to get a picture of that.
Your
dad and you in the flight suit.
He was completely involved. He was willing to do whatever it was that I was doing. He was kind of in it. Just entirely, which was really amazing to kind of see him being just as involved and excited as I was, because that kind of let me feel even more free and excited to do, all the activities and felt more comfortable. But I think kind of going to those space camps was kind of the first times where I was like meeting other people who really like space the same way I did and learning from people that had that same interest in space. And I was like, wow, like this is all the information that I had been dying to know, and everything that I really was like looking for as a kid, I was finally really getting at space camp.
Yeah. You're like circling back with you. I talked to your dad for, I don't know, probably an hour on the phone when we were prepping for this podcast. And what a great guy. Like he just support. And I was just really impressed as a dad. Like, I'm like, oh man, what a great dad. So I was kind of a big fan of your dad when I met him on the phone. And, he gave me a lot of the things that you've done and that we're talking about today. He was the one that kind of filled me in on what was important to you. And he's just a huge, he's like your biggest fan. I really, really appreciate that. How important has that been to have somebody like that in your court? They're going through all of the stuff you've done.
Yeah, I think it is really, really important for kids to have some sort of support in whatever dream or aspiration they may have. And I think sometimes for parents, it can be really hard when, a kid says something crazy like wanting to be an astronaut or wanting to be something that feels very far-fetched. And I think it's really important to kind of encourage those ideas. I think that, kids will slowly fall into what they lean into more and what they're more passionate about. And I think that my dad did just such an amazing job of seeing that I was interested in space and wanting to encourage it, no matter what it led to, whether it was, being an engineer or a scientist or an astronaut one day, or, when I was young, I think he really just leaned into my interest in space. He knew that I liked space and knew that I was interested in being an astronaut. Whether he could control whether or not that happened, he had no idea or no control over that, but he was still encouraging enough to say, okay, you really like this, let's learn more about it. And, I think that I was constantly pulling him into more and more space adventures and activities than he was even prepared for. But I think that it was really important to have some sort of support system. And I think whether that is as involved as my dad was, or someone just saying, oh, you've got this, or I think that's a good idea. I mean, even something as simple as that can really help propel a kid's interest in whatever they're fascinated at.
It's we're so programmed to support in that way for things like club sports. And, the sports is a big thing, big part of the culture, American culture. And we're not really built for the things like you're doing. Like, how can we shift that? How can we get more kids and parents and people more interested in taking some of these paths like you've taken? And just in my business, right, in aviation and airlines, there's so much opportunity. There's so many different things. You don't have to be an astronaut, but there's just so many things in this side of that people just don't think about. How do we change that?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite things to really talk to kids about and really focus on whenever I'm able to kind of speak to an audience of students is just the amount of opportunity and jobs that are out there that they probably don't even know exist, right? And that's especially important, I think, in the space industry, because I think a lot of the time in the space industry, kids think, oh, I have to be an engineer or a scientist. And in reality, there's tens of thousands of different jobs and paths that you could take to slowly end up in the space industry. But I think that when students are in school, they hear a lot of the same traditional jobs of maybe becoming a doctor one day or a lawyer, or maybe a teacher. And, all of those are really great, but it really does target such a small area of the amount of opportunity that kids have. And that's even just jobs that we know of now. I mean, with the way the future's going, and even just in the space industry, there's going to be even more jobs that we don't even know of yet. And the next generation does have the opportunity to go after them, but it really is just letting them know that there's more out there. There's more opportunity. There are jobs that are more tailored to maybe their areas of interest or combining their areas of interest. I get that a lot where maybe students like space, but maybe they also really like something else, but they don't even think of combining the two into a whole new field. And so I think a lot of that is important. Just that exposure is really, I think, what kind of jumpstarts a lot of those ideas.
I was watching a documentary on the space shuttle program. There was a lot of new type of astronauts introduced into, being astronauts at that time. And those people that weren't never even thought about something like that. They were just scientists. And they saw a job opening. I'm going to apply at NASA kind of as a joke. And they ended up getting hired as an astronaut to fly on the space shuttle because they had already figured out how to fly into space. So they needed pilots to do that. Now they're like, well, let's go do science. So it opened a whole new world of opportunity for people to go into space. So I think it's just accelerating now with the space stations and, especially the potential to go to Mars and even go back to the moon. I think that's probably what's going to happen soon. I have always encouraged my kids, find something you love and you're passionate about it and just go after it. And I think that you've kind of you're in a brilliant example of finding something, I think there's probably some luck there too. You found something really early that you're really passionate about and good at, quite frankly. And you're just kind of motoring through it. I had some questions. So some things on your resume that were really, now that we're kind of talking about your path, scuba diving, skydiving, you're a pilot, I only have pilots on this podcast. So you have to be a pilot. Are you really interested? So as Alyssa, the scientist, are those things that really interest you? Or are those things, do they help you? Or do they kind of pave your way to becoming an astronaut? Do they help you become an astronaut?
Yeah, I don't think it was really one way or the other whenever I was first deciding to do them. I think that for me, whenever I was looking at, wanting to become an astronaut, I think I learned pretty early on that becoming an astronaut was more of a destination rather than a career, right? If you meet all these astronauts, they are something, right, before they go to space, whether that's an engineer or a scientist or, whatever else. But I think especially when I was younger, I was really looking to learn more about all of these different careers because I didn't know what I was good at. And I think that, I knew that I liked space from an early age, but I didn't know what I wanted to be from an early age, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
So
totally.
I was really trying to learn more about the space industry to see what do I like and then also what am I good at. And so a lot of those different things I did was really learning more about what I liked and what I was good at and learning more about just like my skills and myself as a person because really you can do so many different things and one day end up in space. And so I knew that the options were almost limitless with whatever I wanted to pursue. It was just figuring out what I actually liked and what I actually wanted to do. And so depending on how old I was interested in trying different things. And so scuba diving was one of kind of like the earliest things that I was kind of able to start doing. And, obviously being underwater is an easy way to simulate being in microgravity. When you're in the pool, you can kind of lift up your friends and it's more of a semi-weightless environment. And so that was kind of cool to kind of first experience something like that. And then moving on to other skills like skydiving, kind of the idea of being in free fall was pretty similar to potentially, being in space or floating and being in that environment. Becoming a pilot was another really big area of interest for me. I was pretty sure that I wouldn't necessarily want to become a pilot professionally, but I was still very interested in pilots and just kind of the career path of it all and learning how to fly and the skills that you gain while learning to fly, I think was really transformative and really important for me. And I think that they were skills that I've kind of transferred over into other areas of my life. And so the more I was trying out different skills and different things, it kind of slowly led to what I've ended up in and learning just more about myself.
Yeah. Well, checklists. Just get really good at checklists. We have, a lot of industries use pilots and what we do in the cockpit as kind of a standard, like, running checklists, the challenge and response, crew resource management, working together as a team to solve problems and all those things. So as a pilot, one of our favorite memories is our first solo. First time our instructor hopped out and we flew. Tell me about your first solo.
Yeah, my first solo was terrifying, actually, because so much of the time, I was always questioning whether or not, I was doing the skill. I think that it's so easy, as a student pilot to think, did I just do that? Or was my instructor, secretly helping me out a little bit? And so I think it takes some time to really build that trust in yourself. And so I remember, we were at the airport and we were doing a few touch and goes. And then he was just all right, you're ready. I'm going to hop out. You go do one. And I was just absolutely terrified. I was really excited, but just so scared to actually take on the adventure. And honestly, just started saying everything out loud, just as if he was there, just trying to make sure that I wasn't forgetting anything. And it was the same feeling kind of throughout any time I flew by myself. I was really just trying to picture him kind of giving me those reminders. And I think that I was just so lucky to have such a good instructor that I think really set me up for a path of success. And it was really exciting. I was really proud of myself. I think a big kind of turning point for me in my flying journey was just learning that I was in charge of the airplane rather than the airplane kind of flying me. Because when I first started, I hated flying. I was like, this is so silly. I'm just always kind of correcting whatever the plane's doing. The plane wants to turn left. I'm trying to fix it and make it go the other way. And so whenever I was finally able to understand that I could control what the airplane was doing was really a big shift for me. And that kind of led to a lot more success in my flying.
My first solo, was when the instructor got out, I was like, no big deal. As soon as I got the airplane in the air, as soon as I took off, and I realized I have to land this now. And that's when it set in for me. Like, oh my God, And just you do the work. You fly the pattern. You follow your checklists, and you do your procedures, and you land safe. And you're like, oh my, it was probably one of your best landings too. So it's always great. Another thing I wanted to ask you: you got to fly with the Thunderbirds in the jet. How was that? Not very many people get to experience that.
Yes, that was such an amazing opportunity. I was so thankful that the Thunderbirds kind of invited me to do kind of like a fun flight. So they came to Shreveport, Louisiana, to do an air show. And it was kind of the day before the air show. They said that we could go up and do like a fun flight before they kind of the whole crew got in to kind of start preparing for their show. And it was just so much fun. It was such a nice team of people, and a fighter jet is just a entirely different ballgame. I was so used to the little Cessnas and kind of some much slower flying. Right. But it was just so much fun. When I first met them, they started asking me questions like how many G's I had ever pulled, and
you're like, what is a 172 pull?
I was like, not too much. I was like, I've done like a few G's, like maybe 3.5. Yeah. And they told me off the bat, well, we'll do at least 5 or 6 on takeoff. And I was like, okay, like on sure, takeoff. Yeah, takeoff. That's the easy part. Right. But it was really cool because they knew of my interest in space, and so he said that he wanted to like take off and then go directly vertical to like almost simulate like a rocket taking off. But they were so nice. He was trying to go through as many maneuvers as possible, but also making sure that I was doing okay. Yeah. And I think it just really gave me a lot of respect for the job and for being a fighter jet pilot, because the amount of endurance they have for all of those different maneuvers. And then, I was just riding in the back. Yeah. I wasn't even, flying the aircraft. And so I couldn't even imagine actually being in control and fully flying at the amount of G's and at the intense level that they were doing.
Were you guys wearing G suits or no G suits?
Yes, so we did wear G suits because we ended up doing a 9G turn. Oh my God. So we went all the way up to 9Gs, which I did not black out during, which was a huge accomplishment. Wow. That was my big goal. I didn't care if I was like completely sick or falling over, but I just didn't want to black out because I was, kind of thinking. Did you start
to get the tunnel vision?
I did. So for me, I mean, obviously the G suit helps, but we also had to practice how to breathe during the 9G maneuver. So for me, I basically tunneled vision to about the size of a bottle cap would be about the size, I would say. And I was just fighting so hard to keep. It was such a small little element of light, but I was just trying to hold on to it so hard. And so I just kind of held on to that little circle of light. And then, as you turn out of the turn, the vision kind of slowly came back with it. And so I was really fighting because all the maneuvers were tough, even if it was, a 5G turn, a 6G maneuver, it was constantly G's after G's. And so once we got to the 9G turn, I told him I needed a break. And then we did the 9G and I was like, all right, I did it. Like, I'm happy.
I mean, did you like get sick or did you like maintain?
I will say I did not feel my best. After it kind of slowly progressed. It just kind of kept building because after so many maneuvers with different levels of G's, I just started getting so tired. And I think that was the biggest thing that I noticed was not necessarily like physically sick, but just exhausted. It is a lot on your body to pull those G's. And so I remember after we were done with the flight, I was ready to just like fall over into bed and like go to sleep.
How long did it take you to recover?
It took us several hours of just kind of like laying down and just kind of relaxing for a bit. The entire flight, I think, was only about like an hour and a half maybe of us just kind of flying around and doing things. But it was just so much.
You were flying that long. That's a long flight.
It was long. It was sometime just kind of getting out to the area where we were able to do those maneuvers. So there was a little bit of buffer, I would say, and just kind of like flying level. But the entire flight was just exhausting, I will say, and I think that was one of the other elements that just gave me a lot of respect for those pilots, because if they're able to
think about
put up with that.
What you're going to endure on a space launch, because that's nothing. I mean, the G's and the violence and think about that. I mean, just that's like a little example of what you're going to, I mean, being G loaded is no joke. A friend of mine has it's called the L-39 Albatross, and we go fly that thing every once in a while. And and you will go up to maybe 5 Gs with no G suit on, but you do that for 30 minutes, you don't feel right for the rest of the day. Your body is completely off. So good on you for doing that. That's pretty cool. What an experience. I have to say, like, you represent sort of what the highest level of human potential and like what people can do, and you're an example of, just following something and just going after it and achieving it. And do you recognize this in yourself, or is it just natural to you?
I think it's kind of a little bit of both. Like, I think to a degree, like, I've been really thankful for so many of these experiences and opportunities, because I think I've learned so much about myself and about what I'm personally like capable of doing. And I think that's something that I've been like really grateful for, is just kind of the opportunity to push myself, because I think so much as people, we just get so scared in like kind of pushing ourselves outside of our normal routines and what we're used to doing. And so I think some of these opportunities, I mean, before I went on the flight with the Thunderbirds, I was terrified. They were telling me how to pull the parachute, and I kind of told my dad. Right. And I told my dad, and I said, look, if I have to pull a parachute, like, I'm gone. Like, I don't know if I can do it. Yeah, I was like, going through an ejection seat and pulling a parachute, I was like, I don't know if I can do all that. I'm going to be honest. It just seems so scary. And a lot of that's really important, to have those safety maneuvers. But I think, there's so much fear in so many things that we do. And then once we're in the moment and doing them, we feel so much more empowered to actually, go after them and to really do it. So I think that, a lot of the time I'm just really grateful that I've been pushed to kind of see what I'm capable of and really take that and kind of build.
Speaking of hard things, you and I, we've met an astronaut in common, Lovell, Commander Lovell. And I'm just super impressed by that guy. And I know a lot about him, but you actually had the opportunity to meet him and go to, I think, a dinner. Tell me about meeting Commander Lovell.
Yeah, it was really amazing. I was pretty young, but we were basically doing a event, and we had like a dinner together the night before, and it was really cool. He was one of kind of the first moonwalkers that I had met, and it was really cool just to meet someone from the Apollo program. And also, I was so fascinated and interested in asking more questions about the Apollo program. But I think he was just even more fascinated to hear about what the next generation was interested in. And so it was just such a conversation rather than, me saying, oh, tell me all about your time at NASA and the Apollo program. He was so fascinated, and I think passionate and interested to see what the next generation was wanting to do. And I think that was so inspiring to see some of, these really inspirational astronauts, being interested in what the next generation wants to do for space.
Yeah. Did he any words of wisdom, any guidance? Like, what did he like? He had to have dropped some wisdom on you.
Yeah, I think he was just so encouraging of my own interests in space, and I think that was so exciting to hear. Whenever I had the opportunity to meet other astronauts, I was always, asking them about how they got to the point that they were, and how I was, able to follow suit, or any advice that they would give. And so I think, he was one of the ones that was just really encouraging to, continue working towards that dream and, doing your best to stand out and be unique and, never really letting that dream go.
Cool. If young kids coming up today they're at home watching cartoons, and they want to be an astronaut, what guidance would you give them? They want to follow in your footsteps.
Yeah, whenever I have other kids that want to do what I've done or, want to also become astronauts, I always say, one, you can do everything that I did and nothing that I've done and still end up in the same place, because there is so much opportunity in space that you really don't have to follow step by step. You really can pave your own way within the space industry. Also, it's really important to, again, think of astronaut as a destination rather than a career. So with that, really just focusing on what you're passionate in doing and maybe rewiring it to a degree to think, okay, what do I want to do in space? Yes, I know I want to go to space, but now let's think, what do I want to actually do in space? Whether that's robotics or engineering or science or medicine or, whatever it could be. But just start thinking about what you would want to do in space, and then start paving your way from there, whether it's, extracurriculars in school, or whether it's camps, or whatever it may be. It's almost tailoring it to what you're passionate and interested in working towards, and also being open to changing along the way. If maybe something doesn't work out, or maybe you change your mind on what you're interested in, it's kind of adapting and always telling people what you're interested in pursuing.
Yeah, cool. I'd like just have one more question, just a couple more questions. We're winding down here, but is there anything that my generation can do to set your generation up, and even the generation behind you, for success? Because we're about to hand it off to you. I was one of the young guys in an industry. I came into my industry at a very young age, and now I'm not one of the young guys anymore. And we've got to start transitioning to the young, new generation. What can I do? Tell me what I can do better to set you up for success.
Yeah, I think some of the biggest factors that kind of the older generation plays in inspiring and encouraging the next generation is, one, being that voice that those careers are possible and attainable. I think another big factor is really teaching the next generation what those jobs look like on a day-to-day basis. I think that was one of the biggest things that really surprised me when I started learning more about some of these space jobs was, okay, they sound really cool, but what are you actually doing on like a day-to-day basis? What does that job actually look like? Because so hard, you can kind of get distracted by almost the glitz and the glam of what the job is doing, that you kind of forget what's actually going on.
Right.
And I think that was hard for me, especially in the space industry, because everything sounds cool, right? It can always sound cool to say that you're working on the biggest, most powerful rocket, or that you're studying a planet, but in reality, what do these jobs mean? And I think kind of explaining what they are can really help the next generation have a better understanding of what they're good at and how that translates to a real job. Yeah. And so I think just really being encouraging and open about what these jobs are will kind of help drive the next generation in figuring out what they're best at.
Okay. I'll do my part. I'll do what I can do. Well, Alyssa, I just want to thank you very much for coming on the show. You've already had a tremendous impact on the world and future, the kids behind you, you inspire them, you inspire me. And I love your story. I love what you're doing. I love the messages you're telling. Just thank you so much for what you're doing. And I'm looking forward to following wherever you go, whether it's in the lab or in space, but I know you're going to inspire people for a long time. So thank you very much for coming on Flight Club. We really appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for watching this episode of the Flight Club podcast. Please subscribe to the show, leave a comment below, and follow us on Instagram at Flight Club Pod. We'll see you next time.